Hello and welcome, everyone, to This Intelligence Squared with me, Carl Miller. I'm delighted today to introduce our guest, Evan Osnos. Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and is the author of a number of books, including Wildlands, The Making of America's Fury, and Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth and Faith, and also a new book called The Haves and Have Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultrarich. Evan, very warm welcome to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Carl. It's great to be with you.
So, Evan, we begin then in a yacht club, don't we? Kind of surrounded by items which I think you describe as the most expensive that our species has ever worked out how to own. What was that like?
Well, you have to step back for a second. If you haven't actually been close to one of these yachts, these are not sailing vessels that you take around the harbor and compete with your cousin and so on. No, these are Leviathans. I mean, these are machines that now cost the better part of $1 billion. They're as long as a city block in some cases. And when I describe them as the most expensive the most expensive objects that our species has ever figured out how to own, that's not an abstract description. I mean, quite literally more expensive than the highest priced real estate in the United States, or let's face it, also the highest price art that's ever been transacted. There's, Salvador Mundi, for instance, which not incidentally now hangs on the wall of a superyacht owned by the Saudi crown prince, or so it's been said. So there is a way in which I came to think of these machines, which were arrayed around us at this yacht club in Monaco, as the icons of a period of our species that I wanted to describe as concretely as possible.
And whilst on the one hand kind of fearsomely sophisticated, on another really reducible to a single metric, aren't they? Like just as the feet, the length of the yacht kind of seems so unbelievably important to the owners.
That's exactly right. I mean, I suppose a little bit like humans themselves. These boats are complex and yet ultimately quite simple. The term in the industry that matters more than anything else really is LOA, which stands for length overall. And so, you can expend hours and hundreds of millions of dollars on the details, but when the two yachts, or perhaps more importantly, the two yacht owners are side by side talking to one another, the number that they're paying most attention to is whose boat is bigger. And the reason why that, to me, is very important is that what we're really talking about here is a level of human hierarchy and insatiability. That's the real coin of the realm. Those are the elements at play in my mind.
And it was a world that seemed like so strangely bifurcated, Evan, that you were peering into. Where on the one hand, one that's shrouded in secrecy, really quite secretive, really not very open to tourism, so to speak, of people moving into that milieu. But on the other hand, absolutely dripping with ostentation. I mean, no one buys an item that's a block in length without wanting people to see it sometimes.
You're absolutely right. And Carl, I kind of found them to be, they occupy a very specific register of existence, meaning that they want to be invisible to most of the public most of the time, but then highly visible and indistinguishable and unmistakable, I should say, to the people who they're trying to signal to, which is their peers. And so, these are designed to be just out of reach, quite literally and figuratively. So for a lot of people, we see and we engage these yachts as mediated through the tabloids or through social media. There'll be a story about, let's say, Jeff Bezos turning up on his yacht in some city in Italy. But then when you actually get close, you find that you are probably physically removed from them by security or by the velvet ropes of our lives of one kind or another. And that also felt to me like a particularly contemporary detail, because the whole lives of the owners of boats of these kinds are designed to be both iconic in our minds and then ultimately separated from us by a moat of actual experience, whether it's economic inequality or or in some cases, just almost physically, the experience is out of reach because it is only available to folks who have the means to reach it.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, also separable in terms of literally a moat, a body of water which they can sail over, which no one else can. And I suppose that leads us to a kind of second bifurcation, which is the actual purpose of all of this, which is kind of, it seems on the one hand, and I guess this is a thread at least I saw running through your book, there's actually a banality at the heart of much of this, isn't there? Which is this is just conspicuous consumption of another kind. This is just, I need to buy a larger yacht than my neighbor in the same way that you might buy a pair of curtains or a more expensive pair of shoes. But on the other, there does seem to be actually a kind of a layered series of benefits. You know, the social benefit, what goes on the yacht stays on the yacht. And even in a slightly more sinister way, the idea that these things can drift into international waters and so outside of the realm or reach of most law enforcement.
Yeah, I think this is why they're so especially popular right now, is that on one hand, they satisfy a very basic, almost biological need to adorn oneself in the latest affectations of status. This goes all the way back to furs and beads. And anthropologists will tell you that we have been essentially organizing ourselves along these lines as with whatever technology or substance is available. Now, you fast forward to today, though, and there is the very specific advantage that accrues to being on a vessel that can, in some ways, become the physical manifestation of an age of mobility in capital and data and nationality and physicality, where to a degree that's really never been as pronounced as it is today. You can be an American billionaire, quote unquote, who happens to have, let's say, a half dozen nationalities of various kinds, depending on what needs you have for tax and residence purposes. Your capital, of course, can reside in jurisdictions beyond the reach of the Treasury. Your data can reside in centers that are perhaps half a world away. And all of this then allows you as the individual to be somewhat unfixable,
fungible.
Yes, fungible. Well said, Carl. That's exactly right. I mean, we've reached the fungibility of human status, and that is a distinct period that requires, I think, definition and elaboration. That's part of the reason what drew me to this.
And well, so let's talk about that actually, Evan. Like, what did draw you to this? And by this, I mean all the different dispatches which the book pulls together. Because you're not interested in yachts per se, are you? You're interested in kind of
Correct.
These different vignettes of the pressures and the opportunities and the lifestyles of the ultra-rich as a way of actually making sense of the moment that we're living through right now. So why don't you tell us a bit about what drew you to these various kinds of investigations that you kind of pulled together for the book?
Yeah, this is, in effect, a field guide, an attempt to try to explain the ecosystem of what is and can only be described as a new Gilded Age. I mean, this is where we find ourselves today. And I've always been interested in the original Gilded Age in America, which, of course, was in the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when you had very similar conditions. I mean, the advent of extraordinary new technologies. At the time, it was, the typewriter and the light bulb and things like that. But then you also had declining life expectancy among the working poor, and you had vast inequality in this country. And I think we're seeing a version of that play out today. And I started to focus on it most specifically in 2016 after Donald Trump was elected in America, because I felt as if it was pretty obvious now that the conventional tools of political analysis were inadequate. We simply had not anticipated or really couldn't even fully metabolize what this guy meant about global politics, about the dynamics and the tensions and so on. And I concluded it was because he was fundamentally a creature of the money world, meaning that he speaks in and navigates and expresses a world that is defined by things like success and dominance and greed and liberty, and these elements that reach beyond politics and get into what are fundamentally economic questions. And that was the architecture that then led me on these various excursions into one subculture or another.
Well, you said we're living through a new Gilded Age, and a point you make, of course, Evan, is that Gilded Ages are also very unstable ones where inequalities can lead to all kinds of political and economic insecurity and peasants' revolts and really quite dramatic kind of attempts, I suppose, from people to try and redistribute wealth in various ways, ultimately. And that brings us to the kind of second dispatch that I'd like to talk about, which are the preppers. Because the ultra-rich aren't just benefiting from the system, are they? They're also acutely aware of how fragile and unstable the system is becoming.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating to me the way in which the platforms themselves, which have created the opportunity for people to meet and to organize and to share anxieties online, whether we're talking about Facebook or Reddit, for instance, are also then owned by or controlled by individuals who are increasingly concerned about the stability of society. I mean, to put a name and a face to it, Steve Huffman, who was one of the co-founders of Reddit and the CEO, he told me that he had gotten eye surgery to basically make him not reliant on contact lenses or glasses, because he's convinced that when there is a social breakdown of some kind, he said, I don't want to have to rely on an external aid for my vision. And he told me that he'd accumulated ammunition and motorcycles and gold, and that he was prepared to bug out of town as needed in the event of a crisis in San Francisco or elsewhere. And this is not unique to him. This is something that I've heard from many, and I describe in the book, tech tycoons who are at the same time that they will describe almost utopian possibilities for technology, that same mindset has also allowed them to play out their own conceptions of how it could all go terribly wrong, and they're taking steps to lay in preparations to protect themselves against that.
Well, if we dwell on quite how terribly wrong it would need to get for a billionaire to be unable to buy a pair of spectacles, that's really that's reasonably
good point.
Chilling kind of prospect. But Evan, in terms of the actual preparations, then, so the word, the preppers, like this is I suppose a kind of loose term for all these people that are making some kind of preparation or other for a breakdown in social order. What are they doing? Because it's become a whole cottage industry, hasn't it, of real estate and equipment, and even a subculture, I suppose, of people that are basically preempting a really significant breakdown in social order.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I mean, a former product manager at Facebook told me, and this is somebody who's done very well financially. He said, "Yeah, I've got an island off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, and it is stocked with independent solar panel complex. It generates its own energy." And he walked me through, and of course he has guns and ammo there. And he walked me through his analysis of how he thinks that there is a mistake that some people make, that they're going to be able to live independently in the event of a social breakdown. He said, no, but what I know is that we'll need to have a network of contacts. I'm paraphrasing here, in a sense saying I've already coordinated with friends with similar ideas. He said, when I started to come out of the woodwork on this, talk about it more publicly, then I discovered all these people in Silicon Valley who agree with me. And I went to New Zealand in the course of this research, because that is really the ultimate gilded refuge, is where you go if you're in San Francisco and you're convinced that things are fragile. You'll just you'll get on your plane and you'll go to Auckland or elsewhere. And Peter Thiel, of course, who is one of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley, he was one of the early pioneers to go to New Zealand and talk about his reasons for being there and for buying property and for developing these estates, is because he thinks that that's where he'll go in the event that things fall apart. And look, I think what's interesting, Carl, that runs beneath this is the almost sense of inevitability, a sense of presumption among some of the architects who are designing these systems, that they know that there is a point at which it will engender public anger. And they talk to me explicitly about the idea that as artificial intelligence begins to eliminate jobs, that this may well turn distress and anger against them. And so that's why they're taking steps to protect themselves.
Is this a particularly like US tech billionaire thing, or is this something that you'd see more broadly reaching across the ultra rich of like the oil sheiks or the multi-generational kind of aristocrats, because, or is this people that spend a lot of time in SF and LA, cities I spent some time in and am continually terrified by, and read a lot of Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and think they're John Galt?
I think you've hit on something important, which is that there's been an element of this in Europe for a while. There is, in fact, a very high-end doomsday complex that you can buy into in Europe. But like a lot of things, the West Coast of the United States becomes a laboratory that can in some ways pick up elements of the culture in the air and then distill them and magnify them through the powers of the industry that they themselves create, whether it's the broadcast media or, in this case, social media, and also the what is an important transition period, which is that we've gone from when the tech tycoons were sort of bland CEO types like Bill Gates to the celebrification of particularly libertarian tech figures like Elon Musk or David Sachs, who is now the AI and crypto czar in the White House. And so then they have an outsized effect that is global in nature, because they are traveling. There are people around the world who do admire them and who pattern themselves after what these guys talk and do, what they talk about and do. And so there is a way that it's almost become a commodified set of values and assumptions about the failures of governance and the need to think beyond government. And I think Silicon Valley's become a node that is essential in understanding the growth of these ideas.
Okay, well, let's move from Silicon Valley to Greenwich, and a kind of a thread I think that you follow in many different ways, which is exploring the relationship between the ultra rich and politics and power. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, Evan, the way that, beginning, as you say, like your forays here in 2016 in the election of Trump, almost everyone at that time was kind of taking a kind of left turn and going up the Appalachian Trail and trying to understand kind of the MAGA heartland and the kind of, the post-industrial dispossessed of the American working class. But just to read you a quote back to you, you say here, we tended to focus on the effects of despair among members of the working class who felt besieged by technology, globalization, immigration, and trade, but that ignored the effects of seclusion among members of the governing class. So you turn a right and instead go to Greenwich, Connecticut. Tell us a bit about the kind of joint venture that you're trying to understand the other half of.
Yeah, well, Greenwich is an interesting place to look because it is, and has been for over 100 years, what you might describe as perhaps the cockpit of capitalism. It's a suburb of New York City, of course, very prosperous. It's where you would have found the CEO or the chairman of General Electric if you had gone looking for him 100 years ago. So it's always had an element in helping us understand the values and the attitudes that define the commanding heights of America's economic power. And it also happens to be where I grew up. And so I had in my bones a sense of what it meant to be a Greenwich Republican, which was almost literally a country club Republican. I'm not making a general point. I mean, this is where the George Bush family dynasty originated. George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, was the local golf champion in town, and he was also the senator from the state of Connecticut. He was the classic, paradigmatic country club Republican, centrist Republican. And in 2016, everybody assumed that that's the kind of candidate that Greenwich would gravitate to. But in fact, local Republicans, it was really amazing to watch, ended up saying, no, we see a lot about Donald Trump that we like and that we want to celebrate. And that was a turning point. It was a sign of how the party that had traditionally rejected people like Trump as being too radical, as being too vulgar, too unseemly, that actually the Country Club Republican of America was making his, and they're mostly his, accommodations to Trump. And so I wrote about how it came to be, and I think it is a story about really a half century of ideas in which the concept of being fundamentally a civic-minded figure who believes that with great power and wealth comes great responsibility, that idea had been quietly eroding and became visible really in 2016 when suddenly the idea that Trump was, as he had been described in the local paper in Greenwich, too vulgar and inhospitable to our values, suddenly the head of the local Republican town committee was standing up and saying, I support this guy, and I think he says everything that we think. And that was a story that needed to be told.
This is so interesting, because I think what most people would probably think had happened was that Trump would be embraced by your country club Republican very unwillingly, very late on, and when basically presented as a choice, it's either Trump or it's Kamala Harris, or it's either Trump or it's whoever, Democrats that they would see as inevitably more hostile to their economic interests. But you're saying he was actually embraced, at least by some Greenwich Republicans, really quite early on.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it became quite clear that the decision was really specific and visible, because you'll remember that Jeb Bush was running in that early primary for the Republican nomination. So here he was the natural heir to the Bush family country club Republican tradition. And as one local Republican described to me, he said, I saw Jeb Bush give a speech at a country club in town, and he was very soft in his language, and he talked about being accommodating to immigration and about making sure that people could settle in this country. And this guy who was telling me the story, he said, I thought, what is he talking about? This is, we're living in a harsh time in which we need to be much more clear and tough-minded. That was the way that he framed it. And when he came out and started speaking in favor of Donald Trump and against Jeb Bush, to his surprise, all of a sudden other people in town came up to him and said, we agree with you and we want to help support what you're doing. I think it's interesting to remember that Greenwich, which is just north of New York City, is also what we always imagined to be the classic coastal elite town. And this is a place that when the final votes were tallied, nobody was surprised that the Democrats came out ahead, because that's what's been the pattern. But within that, the Republican consensus had gravitated so sharply towards Trump and away from the old Republican ethic that it was a sign that the Republican Party was dead, and now it was being reborn in the shape and aesthetic, both morally and otherwise, of Donald Trump.
And what is that 50-year-long procession of ideas or evolution of ideas that has led to that? Because I think there's an easy distinction that one might make here, where you say that Trump's joint venture essentially is a cultural anti-globalization pitch to working class Americans and a anti-regulation and anti-tax pitch to the ultra-rich. But it seems like that embrace is so early on. Like, is that it, or is it that there are actually members of Greenwich that saw something in the things that Trump was saying about immigration as well, and about culture as well, that they saw there to be value in?
Yeah, you have to go back really to the story of conservatism's rise in the latter half of the 20th century. I mean, if you take as the prime moment when Barry Goldwater contended for control of the Republican Party, when he was perceived to be too conservative in the 1960s, that did not actually mean that the gene was extinguished. In fact, there were people in Greenwich who had been supporting Barry Goldwater as a response to the counterculture. I mean, this was what was brewing. There was a story of power in America that was running just beneath the surface of what appeared to be a liberalizing trend among elites. This is what gave rise to the mythology, in some ways, of the sort of Bill Clinton coastal elites who were pragmatic, centrist Democrats and so on. What was actually happening in that time was that there was a corporate movement that started really in the 60s and 70s, when it became clear that profits were imperiled by things like the regulatory state, that if there was going to be an effort to, let's say, rein in profits of the tobacco companies, that there had to be a counter movement. If anybody was going to say that profit must be protected, then it would have to come from the people in positions of power. And that idea, which took form, I suppose you'd describe it as shareholder capitalism now, is that really everything can and should be sacrificed for the sake of prosperity. This idea, which used to be kept in some balance with a belief in, yes, but with that we must protect the rights of workers. We have to make sure the most vulnerable in our society are being educated and their health is protected, that all of those elements began to lose status. And over time, it became a form of fundamentalist profit-seeking, the sense that your fiduciary responsibilities relieved you of any civic burden, and that it was not only okay, but in fact honorable. And Trump, in his way, represented the reification of this concept, that nothing mattered more than winning and profiting.
Well, towards the end of the book, Evan, you kind of alight on two quite deep biographies of individuals that I guess you think exemplify this moment in different ways as well. Let's begin with Zach Horowitz, because I think there you have a story. Well, tell us about Zach Horowitz and how this kind of chimera that he weaves, I suppose, is as important to understand when understanding this moment as the actual kind of huge raging sea of inequality that we're facing and been talking about as well.
Zach Horowitz is, at first glance, a splendid American story. I mean, here is a young man from Indiana who dreamed of making it in Hollywood. He had a little bit of a knack for, or at least an interest certainly in acting, and he was always interested in business. He started telling his friends about how he'd met Howard Schultz, the coffee tycoon, and Schultz had given him a job as a scout for up-and-coming entrepreneurs like him. And he and his wife lived in Hollywood, and they started to really live like royalty. I mean, they had a gorgeous house with a cinema in the basement, and Zach actually started appearing on screen in movies with real actors like Brian Cox, the father in Succession, and he was in a film directed by Ralph Fiennes, and he was getting rich.
Quite good in one appearance.
Well, he was starting to really make his way, and you could see him on screen. He did a brilliant job as a psychopath in a particularly bloody horror movie. Except then the FBI showed up at his front door, and it turned out that Zach Horowitz had conducted the most lucrative Ponzi scheme in Hollywood history. He had raked in close to $750 million, according to prosecutors, and along the way had also been buying his way onto screen. And I talked to some of the filmmakers who we worked with, and they said, it was always so strange to us that we had to we were being told we had to cast this guy because he was quite literally the worst actor we'd ever dealt with. I mean, one director described the experience as like trying to direct a dead horse. And so I came to see the story of Zach Horowitz as a perfect distillation of fake it till you make it, which is, I'd say, perhaps more than any other, the creed of our time. And he mastered it brilliantly until, of course, it sent him off to prison for 20 years.
Okay, well, sidebar, I had no idea that people bought themselves onto screen in LA. I mean, that in and of itself is a kind of fascinating revelation of the realities of the entertainment industry. I just thought everyone naively is on there because of merit, not because, they might have underlying financing of the actual undertaking.
Well, you're right, Carl, that was a revelation for me, too. And it hasn't really until I was fortunate to stumble on this story. We had not seen a case that laid out quite as vividly that phenomenon, the idea of pay to play on Hollywood screens, that kind of clues you in to a level of illicit transaction that is happening across the world of Hollywood every day, and is only getting bigger and more complex as the numbers get bigger.
But you're right. I mean, this kind of fake it till you make it, and I guess more broadly, like the scams and the frauds, they've just been coming thick and fast, haven't they? I mean, there's been so many of them. I mean, all the way from like FTX, WeWork, through to a Bad Blood and Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. I mean, there's been a succession of giant kind of frauds or scams, or at least business collapses of some kind or other. Like, how do you fit that into your kind of broader analysis of the moment? Is it people desperately trying to become a member of the ultra wealthy, or at least behave like them, because they just can't contemplate being on the other side of that equation?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the cultural effect of what happens when the canyon between the winners and the losers gets so vast that it creates a kind of frantic quality among people to try to get themselves scrambling up the cliffside to the winning side of it, because the prospect of losing out begins to feel unbearable. And we're at a time when, as we all know, trust in institutions is eroding or collapsing. People aren't quite sure who has authority anymore. And so that has just been a golden age for the con man, because you can have somebody like Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos who says, I am a disruptor. I am here I am the tribune of the people. I am here to tell you that the old way of doing research, which is laborious and expensive and contained within the laboratories of these few incumbent corporate powers in healthcare, that they're doing it all wrong, and that actually there is this brilliant new way of doing it. And that is inherently appealing also to a certain kind of mind. And it's not incidental that in the case of the Theranos con, that some of the people who were duped, take, for instance, George Shultz, who had been a former Reagan Republican administration advisor, or Henry Kissinger. These were not technologists, but these were particularly older American men who felt that they were losing touch with the frontier of creation, and that they felt as if, well, maybe this is the person who will bring me into it. Of course, it was all nonsense. So we're in a time of the charlatan as the defining cultural figure on the land. And that's true in the highest reaches of public office, and also in some of the most powerful economic institutions today.
Well, and that brings us to Mars Guo. I'm not sure what he is. I mean, not entirely a fabulist, because he seems to be genuinely actually extremely rich, at least in one point as well. But certainly someone who has woven like kind of has gone throughout his entire life weaving identity after identity for himself in this way, which both seems like fluid and entirely dishonest, and also very effective.
Yeah, I found him to be a completely fascinating character. Part of this is that I've spent much of my career working on China and lived there for 8 years. And Miles Guo is a figure who is perhaps our most iconic global citizen, by which I mean, here he is, a man who went off to prison as a teenager. He was arrested, depending on who you believe, for either small-time fraud. He tried to present it actually as a case of political dissidence, that he was a freedom fighter. Well, the net effect was that while in prison, he seems to have been embraced by elements that combine the Chinese mafia and the Chinese intelligence services. He ends up becoming enormously wealthy. When I lived in Beijing, he had this building that everybody recognized because it was right on the edge of the Olympic Park and it was shaped like a dragon. I mean, it was this fantastical thing. And then he ended up fleeing the country because his patron, who was the head of Chinese counterintelligence, had a falling out. And he lands in the United States. And I tell the story of how he found himself and worked his way into some of the most influential offices in American politics, to the point that he was such a close friend and patron of Steve Bannon that when Steve Bannon was arrested, it was, to bring everything around to a close here, he was arrested on Miles Guo's yacht right off the coast of Connecticut, not far from Greenwich. And that, I said, that may be the story of our time, all stitched together into one very strange and fascinating one.
Well, that's a wonderful circularity, Evan, to end it on. But one final question, I think, for you. Kind of stepping back and seeing these dispatches all side by side, where is this going to go in your mind? Like, is this another golden age? Is this a refeudalization? Is this something which is going to collapse? It's hard to see the politics that is going to resolve this in a peaceful and democratic way.
I worry a great deal about the stability and fragility of society. And history is eloquent on the risks. You just look at the fall of ancient Rome, for instance. And yet at the same time, and this is not just a kind of false, mealy-mouthed optimism, I'm quite aware of the way that public opinion has an oscillating effect, and that when things get so far out of the norm of our experience, particularly when it comes to inequality and the collapse of social mobility, that people do begin to agitate and organize, and we're seeing it in this country. And I have a pretty firm belief that for all of America's democratic failings today, that there is still a capacity for people to say, this is not right, this is not fair, and this is not sustainable, and to begin to put pressure in ways that only the public can. I mean, as I talk to historians about this very question, sort of the big final question of this topic, is the only way that you check oligarchic power is with citizen power. And that is, for me, the great takeaway. And I think when you begin to see efforts to organize in response to Trump's violations of the law, that is the demonstration of citizen power.
Well, Evan, thank you very much. That was Evan Osnos, everyone, author of The Haves and the Have Yachts. It's brilliant. You should get it, and it's available now online or at a bookshop near you. I've been Carl Miller, and you've been listening to Intelligence Squared. Thank you, as ever, so much for joining us.